How should free market supporters think about welfare programs? Is road congestion pricing a good idea? And what's the matter with the Endangered Species Act? I'm Dominic Pino, Thomas L. Rhodes Journalism Fellow with the National Review Institute, and we'll look through those questions on this episode of Econception. Econception is a podcast of the American Institute for Economic Research that looks at the economic issues of the day and broader economic concepts behind them. We're recording today on location from deep within the files of the Social Security Administration, where it's still not entirely clear how this program even works. I wanted to talk about welfare programs today because I wrote a giant piece about it for Fusion Magazine, which is an online publication of AIER, same folks who publish this podcast. And I wrote this piece where I list 8 different principles for free market conservatives, people like me, hopefully people like you, but even if you don't necessarily agree with that, I hope you'll find it interesting. These 8 principles are to help guide us to think about welfare programs. Because I think there's a problem that we have on the free market side where we often get attacked by people, especially on the left politically, who say, you guys don't believe government should do anything for welfare, for poor people. And there are some people who believe that, but I don't think that is actually the right free market position. And to back that up, I looked at what Adam Smith thought, looked at what Milton Friedman thought, and I looked at what Friedrich Hayek thought. All of them, at the very least, didn't object to government welfare programs out of hand. But they also objected to various problems that can arise from them, and these are things that we need to keep an eye out for. So I'm going to run through these 8 principles that I derived from their thinking and just talk a little bit about what I think these mean. So the first one is that, just starting off, the best way to encourage the welfare of the people is a free economy with low taxes and a flexible labor market. So again, the first principle for free market welfare policy is the best way to encourage the welfare of the people is a free economy with low taxes and a flexible labor market. This is important because we want to say right off the bat that the government is not the source of income. It is not the source of prosperity. Government is, 9 times out of 10, an impediment to prosperity. It's a problem. It gets in the way of markets working and of people being able to make a living. And so, what we want to do is keep the government limited, to leave space for people to live their lives. So, one way to do that is through keeping the tax burden low. We don't want the government to be taking a bunch of our income because, obviously, we don't want our income to be taken by anyone. Now, this doesn't mean taxation is inherently is inherently bad or that there should be no taxes. There are things that the government needs to do that cost money. But I think the principle here was best set out by Calvin Coolidge, who said that taxation beyond what is necessary for the government to do those things is legalized larceny. And so there's an amount that the government will need to raise, but we should keep that amount low by keeping the government constrained. That second point is a flexible labor market. This is one thing that the United States does very well, compared especially to other countries. In a lot of other countries, you have extremely powerful labor unions that enforce very rigid rules on the labor market. And that's how you get structural unemployment in a lot of European countries that's higher than it is in the United States. Now, structural unemployment is unemployment that happens normally in an economy. It's not the result of an economic downturn. It's the result of government policies. And European countries, for the most part, have decided that they're okay with putting up with higher structural unemployment so that they can have these more rigid job markets. But going back all the way to Adam Smith and the Wealth of Nations, we see that this is not what free market supporters should be doing. Smith talked about the poor laws, which were a sort of old-timey version of the welfare state that existed in his time in England. And what they did was they created barriers for poor people looking for work because their benefits under the poor laws were tied to the jurisdiction in which they lived. And so it created all these problems of people trying to move to different places. And then the different places they moved to said, hey, wait a minute, you're not from here. You shouldn't be here. We don't have the money to give to you, or we don't want to give the money or food or clothes to you that you think you're entitled to under the poor laws. And so Smith talked about how this was a big violation of poor people's liberty. Created real problems back then. Today, though, like I said, in the United States, we're pretty good on this. Things like independent contracting allow extremely flexible working arrangements. You basically get to decide how much work you're going to do. We see that in all sorts of industries. A lot of times journalists only talk about it in the context of the gig economy. And that is one part of it, but it's only one relatively small part of it. There's a whole bunch of independent contracting that goes on all over the place. And the labor market in the United States just has constant churn. About 4 million people every month in the United States change jobs. 4 million every month. That's a good sign. Especially right now where we have pretty low unemployment. And we also have pretty low layoffs. It's not like people are constantly getting laid off and are looking for work for long periods of time. Right now, most of those 4 million people will find another job pretty quickly. And that's a really good sign because that helps us to match up skills and talent with jobs that best fit. And so those things are really what help people to get ahead. Those things are the things that create prosperity in a country. A free economy, low taxes, and a flexible labor market. Government does not do those things. What government's job is to make space for those things to happen. So things like enforcing the law, ensuring the rule of law, especially in business. You should be able to go to a court and get an impartial judgment on disputes that you have. The United States in general, especially compared to the rest of the world, is very, very good at that. And so these are the kind of things that government can do to help with that kind of prosperity in the long term. Now, it is obviously the case that not everybody will get ahead, and some people will be in poverty. And so that leads us to the second principle, which is government welfare programs are a legitimate function of the state. They are legitimate. That's my position. It's Friedrich Hayek's position. So I don't think you can accuse me of being anti-free market here by saying this. It's also Milton Friedman's position. Hayek devoted the third part of his book, Constitution of Liberty, to what he called freedom in the welfare state. Hayek was writing this in 1960. I should say it was published in 1960. He probably wrote it a couple years before. But the important thing to know is that this is after World War II. This is after we're pretty clear on the problems that come with socialism as displayed in the Soviet Union. And a lot of the idealism around socialism has faded off by this point in history. And it was replaced in many societies, especially in Europe, with idealism about the welfare state. And so what Hayek was doing is he was looking at what was going on in Europe, what was going on with the welfare state, and he was saying, okay, so how do I reconcile what he thought was a good society, a free society, with the welfare state? And one of the things he notes is that because the welfare state came after socialism, it is not socialism. It's an alternative to socialism. It's a big redistribution scheme. That's what the welfare state is. And it can occur in countries with different amounts of overall economic freedom. And so Hayek looked back at history and said, look, this isn't a new idea. He said in Constitution of Liberty, quote, all modern governments have made provision for the indigent, the unfortunate, and disabled, and have concerned themselves with questions of health and the dissemination of knowledge. It can hardly be denied that as we grow richer, that minimum of sustenance which the community has always provided for those not able to look after themselves, and which can be provided outside the market, will gradually rise, or that government may, usefully and without doing any harm, assist or even lead in such endeavors. So that's Hayek talking. So what he's saying is, governments have always provided for the poor. Again, you can go back to the example that Smith talks about with the poor laws in England in the 1700s. And those started even a couple hundred years before that. Friedman, similarly, in Capitalism and Freedom. He says, quote, we might all of us be willing to contribute to the relief of poverty provided everyone else did. And then he said that he accepts that line of reasoning as justifying governmental action to alleviate poverty, to set, as it were, a floor under which the standard of life of every person in the community. So again, that's Milton Friedman. So government welfare programs are a legitimate function of the state. But remember, we've got 6 more principles left, so it doesn't stop there. Here's the third one. Government welfare programs should be structured to discourage long-term dependence, providing a safety net for hard times, not a lifelong support structure. So this is one of the first principles of limitation on the welfare state. What can sometimes be described as cradle-to-grave benefits are not consistent with a free market position. Now, there may be some limited exceptions to this for people with very severe disabilities, for example. But in general, for most people, welfare programs should exist to provide support in hard times. So things like unemployment insurance, for example. Some payments to make up for lost income for a limited period of time for people who lose their jobs. Help keep you on your feet so that you can find a new job. That basic concept is one example of this principle. Now, there are all sorts of problems with unemployment insurance. I'm not defending everything about how that actually plays out. But the basic idea behind that program, really those programs, since a lot of that is run by state governments, is consistent with this idea. Another limitation is the fourth principle. So the third principle talked about the time involved. The fourth principle talks about the people who should be beneficiaries. The fourth principle is that government welfare programs should be targeted broadly at helping the poor, not at specific subsets of people within the poor or at the non-poor. So again, government welfare programs should be targeted broadly at helping the poor, not at specific subsets of people within the poor or at the non-poor. One of the issues that we have today is that a lot of the recipients of government benefits in the United States are not poor. When we talk about programs like Social Security, for example, programs like Medicare, these programs deliver benefits to seniors by virtue of their age, not by virtue of how poor they are. Now, there are some adjustments in Social Security to make it somewhat progressive, meaning that poorer people get more benefits relative to their income than wealthier people do. But in general, what Social Security actually does is it redistributes wealth from the relatively poor to the relatively wealthy. It does that by redistributing wealth from people who are currently working to people who are retired. On average, retired people, seniors, are better off than working people. Simply because working people are younger. Lots of people are working in entry-level jobs, working in not particularly well-compensated jobs. Whereas seniors have had their entire life to accumulate wealth, to accumulate resources, to save money. Many of them do. And so, on average, they're better off than people who are working. That's what Social Security does. There is no little box with your name on it that your Social Security taxes go to, and then you get it back when you retire. All of the money that you pay in Social Security taxes goes out the door right away to retired people right now. And so that's one of our biggest programs in the United States. One of the biggest parts of the federal budget is the Social Security program. And a lot of it goes to help people who aren't poor. It goes to people who are middle class, people who are upper class. The same is true of Medicare. Medicare goes to the healthcare costs of mostly middle class people. Milton Friedman pointed out that this is especially unfair because poorer people tend to work more years of their life because a lot of them don't go to college. So they got 4 more years on the front end of their life. They might work a little bit longer before they retire. And on average, and this is just an unfortunate reality, on average, poor people die sooner than wealthier people do. And so they have fewer years in retirement of collecting the benefits too. And remember, I said the money you pay in doesn't have your name on it, doesn't belong to you. So if you die, it's possible that your spouse will receive benefits, but it's not like you get that money back. And so Social Security ends up, through that mechanism, also taking from poorer people and giving to wealthier people. Because poorer people pay into it for more years, and they collect from it in fewer years. Again, all of that is on average. There are, of course, plenty of examples of poor people who live a long time, wealthy people who die young, etc. But on average, that's the situation. And so a huge chunk of our budget right now, the federal budget, is to subsidize the consumption of retirees, not to help the poor. The other component of that principle, like I said, is that welfare programs should be broadly targeted at helping the poor. So that means that we shouldn't have separate programs for poor farmers and poor factory workers and poor healthcare workers and poor people of certain races or religions or ethnicities or immigration status or anything like that. We should have government programs that just help poor people based on their income. And this is where Milton Friedman and his idea for a negative income tax really shine through. So here's what Friedman said in Capitalism and Freedom. It's from the same section I was talking about before, where he says that, the state does have a role for poverty alleviation. But what he says is what we should do is a thing called the negative income tax, which means that you set some floor for income. You let people make whatever they make in a year. If their income for that year is below that floor, they get subsidized up to that floor at a certain rate. So that's a negative income tax, right? Positive income tax is when you pay money at a rate to the government. What Friedman is saying is for poor people, we should have a negative income tax where we pay them at a rate. And then you only get taxed on money that you make above whatever that floor is. So just to keep the math simple, let's say we set the floor at $100. Obviously, people don't make $100 in a year, but I just want to keep the numbers easy so that you can follow along. So let's say we set the floor at $100 and someone makes $80. Okay, so they're below the floor, so they get subsidized. And let's say the subsidy rate is 50%. So what that means is that we calculate the difference between the floor and what they made. So 100 minus 80, that's $20. And they get subsidized at 50% of the $20. So half of 20 is 10. So they get $10, and then their income for the year, after the negative income tax, goes up to $90 instead of 80. So you can see if they make no money at all in a year, they make $0, they get a subsidy of $50. And their income goes up to $50, and all of their income would come from the government, right? Hypothetically. So what this helps to do is it scales the money for people who need it. So people who make less money get a lot more benefit. People who make more money don't. And it ensures that all the money is just going to poor people. Because people who make above the floor, so let's imagine somebody who makes $110, and let's say the tax rate on money above the floor, which is going to be a lot lower than the subsidy, right? Because most people are not poor. So let's say the tax rate for that is 20%. You make $110. 110 minus 100 is 10. 20% of 10 is 2. So you'd pay $2 in taxes. And you get to keep the other 108. Because you only get taxed on the money that you make above the floor. So that's the negative income tax. The good thing about the negative income tax, as Friedman puts it, is that we know exactly how much it costs. We don't have to worry about some huge tangled mess of welfare programs like we have right now. Where we're subsidizing people's food in this bucket, we're subsidizing their health care in this bucket, we're subsidizing their child care in this bucket. We should just subsidize incomes through a negative income tax and then let them make decisions on how they should spend their money. And like I said, too, none of these benefits will go to people who make above the income floor. The other good thing about it, too, is that there's no benefit cliffs. Because it's a percentage of the difference between what you make and the floor, it always pays to make more money on your own. Right now, there's lots of people on welfare programs that have to worry about making too much money, because if they make too much money, they would lose more in benefits than they gain in income. That's really not fair. The negative income tax avoids this problem. You can test it out for yourself. Like I said, if you had someone who made $80 a year, and the floor is $100, they would get a subsidy of $10, and they would end up at $90. If you actually made $90, if that was your income, the difference between 190 is 10. 50% subsidy would be $5. So if you made $90, you'd end up with $95. So it always pays to make more money. That removes a lot of disincentives that we currently have to people getting ahead. So why are government welfare programs oftentimes so screwed up? That's principle number 5. Government welfare programs are well-intentioned, but they are subject to the same interest group pressures, bureaucratic tendencies, mission creep, and waste as other government programs. So that's the 5th principle. Government programs are well-intentioned, but they're subject to the same interest group pressures, bureaucratic tendencies, mission creep, and waste as other government programs. Oftentimes, people talk about welfare programs as though they're in this separate container from the rest of the government. That we don't have to worry about all of the very obvious problems that we see in, for example, the Defense Department or in agriculture programs or in various border security immigration programs. We see all these problems in all these other places because welfare programs are government programs. they're going to be subject to the same public choice problems, the same pressures that screw up other government programs. We shouldn't be surprised at this. That's what they are. And so that's something that we need to keep in mind when designing welfare programs. That's another reason why the negative income tax is a good idea, because it's very simple. It is based on arithmetic, pretty simple formula that you can explain pretty easily, and we can see exactly how much money is going to certain people. It doesn't require a whole army of bureaucrats to administer. It just requires writing checks. That kind of idea is going to have a better chance of succeeding and a better chance of actually helping poor people than what we have right now. What we have right now, this is really crazy when you just look at the numbers. If you add up the spending on Medicaid, CHIP, and all non-veteran income security programs, so I'm not including any veterans benefits, I'm not including Social Security, and I'm not including Medicare, because those really are not anti-poverty programs. Remember, most of the benefits of those go to the middle class. But Medicaid, CHIP, and these other income security programs, things like food stamps, things like WIC, programs like that, most of those benefits do go to poor people. If you add up all the spending on those programs, it was $1.082 trillion last year. So just over $1 trillion on anti-poverty programs, not including entitlement programs. According to the Census Bureau, there are 36.8 million people below the poverty line in the United States. And that is an overestimate of how many people are actually in poverty. Because the official poverty measure is not a very good measure of poverty. But we're going to use that definition because it's an overestimate. Because I want to give you a conservative estimate of how much money the government spends on anti-poverty programs. So if you divide that just over $1 trillion by the 36.8 million people who are below the poverty line, the government spent $29,402 per person below the poverty line in 2023, which is the most recent year we have all these numbers. That's almost $30,000 per person in poverty. Okay, if that money was actually going to the people in poverty, they wouldn't be in poverty. What a lot of that money gets tangled up in is government bureaucracy, and it doesn't end up actually getting to the poor people. So that's one of the problems that comes in when you have these very complicated programs. You end up just wasting a lot of money. It doesn't end up going to actually help the people it's supposed to help. Principle number 6 is that government welfare programs are costly, not value-adding to society as a whole. This is really an argument against the sort of Franklin Roosevelt view when he talked about the freedom from want. And his idea is basically that one of the freedoms that government needs to protect is the freedom from poverty. And that by doing so, government makes society as a whole better off. Now again, welfare programs are a legitimate function of the state, but they're costly. Government spending is not free money. The only way the government can get money is either by taxing people now or by borrowing money, which is equivalent to taxing people in the future. It can also print money, which is another form of tax called inflation. Government money is not free. And so when we have government money being redistributed for welfare programs, that is a cost. Now, like all categories of government spending, you can argue that it's a cost worth paying. But that's a different thing than saying that it's free or that it's value-adding. I think a program like a negative income tax, if we had that, and just that, would be a cost worth paying. Obviously, I get very concerned by the fact that we currently spend about $30,000 per person in poverty. And there, I think we can say that's probably not a cost worth paying. We should be able to help the poor more responsibly than that. And part of that would come with actually restricting benefits to the poor and not to the middle class. So the seventh principle is that government welfare programs are not inherently socialist, but they can become socialist over time. That goes back to that idea from Hayek I was talking about earlier, which is that socialism is an alternative to the welfare state. It was one that in Europe was turned away from after World War II in favor of the welfare state. So they're not the same thing. So if you say, we shouldn't have this government program or this welfare program because it's socialist, well, it's not really socialist. But Hayek also warned that programs can become socialist over time. We have a great example of this in the United States, which is subsidized student loans. Started off as a welfare program. The idea was, if you can't afford to go to college, government will help you pay for it with subsidized loans. Then, strangely enough, as part of Obamacare, for a whole separate host of reasons, the student loan industry was nationalized. Another word for nationalized is socialized. Now the government, through the Department of Education, runs that whole thing. The student loan program today is socialism. We've seen this with the Biden administration just wiping away debt for lots of people, transferring that to taxpayers, which they said they have the power to do because, hey, we're the government. It's our program. So that's an example of how a welfare program can become a socialist program. That's something that we need to watch out for. And finally, the eighth principle is that the government welfare programs that currently exist in the United States are fiscally unsustainable, and they're based on false premises about who they benefit, how they're funded. This is a lot of stuff I've mentioned earlier, talking about the misconceptions about how Social Security works. The money's not actually yours. Hayek talked at length about progressive income tax, which funds a lot of the welfare state. He says that was adopted under false premises. It's crazy when you look at the history of it. Hayek said that the first modern progressive income tax, again, there's some debate about what you consider modern, but he says the first modern progressive income tax came in Prussia, the now part of Germany. It came in Prussia in 1891. The highest rate was 4%. In 1910, the first British progressive income tax topped out at 8.25%. And in 1913, the first American progressive income tax topped out at 7%. And all of these taxes were adopted under the belief that the rates would not be too high. They said, look, this is just the richest people are going to pay 7% of their income. Poor people don't have to pay it at all. Most middle-class people will barely have to pay it. That was how these progressive income taxes were adopted. Obviously, that didn't happen. It didn't stay that way for long anyway. In the middle part of the 20th century, a lot of these countries had progressive income taxes that topped out at 90%. Now, we've come back down in a lot of the developed world. So the United States, the top rate now is below 40%. But that's still way higher than the 7% we started out at. It's the same story with a lot of other welfare programs. Government goes to the people and says, hey, do you want to help the poor? The people go, absolutely. And then government creates a program that mostly benefits the middle class. That costs way more than they promised, and then requires tax increases to pay for it. Or borrowing, which, like I said, is just a tax in the future. So Hayek was really concerned with this, that a lot of these programs were basically adopted under false premises. That really hurts in a democracy, where you have to have some trust between the people and the government. But they're not going to do stuff like that. But we're in a real problem right now where, like I said, we're spending $1 trillion on anti-poverty programs. We're spending another $1 trillion roughly on Social Security and another $1 trillion on top of that on Medicare. If you look at the federal budget right now, what it is a system of subsidies for retirees with some subsidies for poor people and a military on the side. That's not really what governments are for. And that's a big, big problem. And so I hope this will help you to think about welfare from a free market perspective. Because like I said, these programs aren't going away, but they can certainly be run a whole lot better than they are right now. And I think we should turn to Adam Smith, Friedrich Hayek, and Milton Friedman for some ideas on how to do it better. So I went a little long on that segment just because I thought it was important to get through those principles and describe them to you. So I'll hit a couple other more current events related things now. First one is the congestion pricing in New York City. This is supposed to be an economic idea based on market principles, but it's not really that in practice. Now, the basic idea of road congestion pricing makes some sense. So let's think about that first. It's really just the principle that in general people should pay for services that they use. Right? If you're paying for something, you're going to use it more responsibly than if someone else is paying for it. And whoever's providing that service is going to have incentive to make it better because you who are using it are paying for it. And if you don't like it, you're not going to pay for it. And then the provider won't make that money. So roads are a service. They're provided by the government. We do pay for the roads through the gas tax, the federal gas tax and the state gas tax. And that's a pretty good way of paying for the roads because you buy more gas, you pay more tax. So people who drive the most pay for the roads that they're using. The problem, though, is that in very, very densely populated urban areas, which there aren't a ton of in the United States, but Manhattan certainly is one. It's by far one of the most densely populated and most congested. And so what New York City did is they said, we're going to make a congestion zone. Now, you could do this in a way that economically, at least, is sensible. What you need to do is you need to charge based on how congested it is at any given point. So that number would fluctuate throughout the day, right? In the morning and evening commute, it would probably be really high. Middle of the night, it would be really low, might be zero. At various times throughout the day, if there's a big event in a certain area, it might go up. And we have the technology to do this. It already is used on some toll highways, where they measure the traffic and then they adjust the toll rate based on that. So you could do something like that. And the point of that is to make you think twice about making the highway or the roads too congested. If you don't have to pay a price, you're going to drive in without probably thinking about it. If you do have to pay a price, that's going to make you say, oh, okay, is it worth however many dollars right now for me to take this path? Because congestion imposes costs on other people. When you're taking up space on the road, that's space that other people can't use. When other people are on the road, they're taking up space that you can't use. And so congestion pricing is a way to try to fix that problem. Just put a price on it, make you think about it, so that you truly bear the costs of your decisions and therefore are paying for the services that you're using. The money from that congestion pricing then should be used for the roads because that'll help to make the roads better for the people who drive on them. That might include expanding the capacity, if it's possible, to allow more people to use them. So that means that the people that are paying for the roads get the benefit of the roads. So again, that principle goes both ways. So New York City didn't do this at all. What New York City did instead was they said, we're going to have congestion pricing. But really, it's just a fee. It doesn't adjust based on the traffic. It adjusts only during the day. It's at $9 to cross 60th Street in Manhattan. So that's from about Midtown Manhattan all the way down to the southern tip of Manhattan. That whole area, if you want to drive in that area, you just pay $9 during the day, and at night, overnight, it's $2.25. So it doesn't really adjust based on congestion. It's just kind of a barrier to keep people out of a certain area. And the money that's raised, it doesn't go to the roads. It goes to the MTA, which runs the public transportation. So the subway, commuter trains, buses, things like that. Well, that doesn't create a good incentive, because really all that's doing then is you're just taxing drivers to subsidize the subway. And New York already subsidizes the subway in many other ways through the tax system. So really what the congestion charge in New York is, it's not really congestion pricing based on the economic principles that I described. It's really just a tax on drivers to pay for the subway. Now, if you really wanted to get crazy, if you really wanted to help to keep costs down on the subway, one interesting idea might be to privatize it. That way you could actually keep those principles that I was talking about. You should pay for the services you're using. Right now, subway riders pay a price-controlled fare of $2.90 no matter how far they go. If you privatize this and allow it to actually have a more competitive market price, which is probably going to be higher than that price-controlled price, you'd be able to just raise more money from people riding the subway. You could also raise money from an IPO of privatizing it. The Tokyo Metro just did this last year. They raised over $2 billion in an IPO to privatize part of the Tokyo Metro. And I don't have to tell you that the Tokyo Metro is much better run, much cleaner, much safer than New York City one. And so if we actually believe that transportation is important and valuable, that should mean it can be profitable. And it would be a much better way to go about fixing New York City congestion than the so-called congestion pricing. Another recent issue is about the Endangered Species Act. This is another case of well-intentioned government policy creating bad incentives and all sorts of different problems. So the Endangered Species Act was passed in 1973, so it's been in effect for 52 years now. And it doesn't work very well. Jonathan Adler wrote about this for the 50th anniversary of the law, so these numbers might have slightly changed in the last 2 years. But to give you a rough picture, he said that the federal government takes credit for 71 species that were listed under the Endangered Species Act as actually recovering. So they got 71 success stories, but that's less than 3% of the total number of species that have been listed over 50 years. And even that 71 is probably an overestimate, because there's a whole bunch of other factors not related to the Endangered Species Act that have allowed species to recover. Part of the problem here is that the Endangered Species Act contains really bad incentives for landowners. If you discover an endangered species on your land, you lose a bunch of your property rights. And the government has huge regulatory power to come in and tell you what to do. Well, most people don't want that. And so what they will try to do is destroy potential habitats for endangered species on their land. If they find an endangered species on their land, they might be tempted to just kill it and not talk about it because they don't want to lose their property. It would make a lot more sense if the government said, hey, if you find an endangered species on your land, we will help give you more resources to take care of it, if it was really about saving endangered species. But what actually happens a lot of the time is that because there's that huge regulatory power that gets unlocked once an endangered species is found, it gives people with ideological agendas strong incentives to go out and search for endangered species, and if they can't find one, make one up. Because it's really not as cut and dry as you might think to determine what an endangered species is. There's debate among biologists even about what species are. If something's a species or a subspecies. This stuff isn't as cut and dry as you might think. And so if you can convince a court that your species is in fact an endangered species, you can block just about any major project you want in the United States. So the New York Times has reported on an example of this from the very beginning of the Endangered Species Act back in the 70s. It's the case of the snail darter. This is a type of minnow that was found in the Little Tennessee River, where the Tennessee Valley Authority wanted to build a dam. And environmentalists opposed this dam, and so they went and found the snail darter. This case got all the way up to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said, look, it's an endangered species. Law says what it says. You can't build a dam. Now, we know, at least according to a biologist at Yale, that the snail darter doesn't exist. It's actually just a different population of a different fish called the stargazing darter, which is not endangered at all. It's perfectly fine. They discovered this fish that they thought was a snail darter down near Alabama and Mississippi, nowhere near the spot in Tennessee where they were supposedly endangered. And they came to the conclusion that actually this is the same species and there's tons of them and it's not endangered at all. What this biologist at Yale, Thomas Neer, he calls this the conservation species concept. He says it's where people are going to decide a species should be distinct because it will have downstream conservation implication. Now, I'm not super interested in defending this dam project, which was, again, a Tennessee Valley Authority federal government project that was sort of pork barrel spending back in the 70s. But I am interested in the bad incentives that the Endangered Species Act creates to empower activists to block projects for reasons that don't have anything to do with the project itself, instead have to do with invented species like the snail darter, and the fact that it really doesn't do a very good job at conserving endangered species. But the federal government pats himself on the back for this. In 2022, the Secretary of the Interior put out a statement saying, "We did it! The snail darter has recovered." She called it a remarkable conservation milestone that tells a story about how controversy and polarization can evolve into cooperation and a big conservation success. It's not real. So, the incentives here are very bad. We've known this for a very long time, and yet the law continues to exist. Because if you say that you're against it, then it's obviously because you want to kill all the endangered species. That's not true. In fact, if you're interested in helping endangered species, you should be pretty upset by how poorly the Endangered Species Act has done at doing that. But that would require a little bit of understanding of economics to try to make it better. Well, now it's time for the paper of the episode. But before that, if you've enjoyed this episode, please subscribe and leave us a positive review wherever you get your podcasts. It helps us to know that you enjoy the show, and it makes the show more visible for others to start listening as well. Paper of the episode is from the Journal of Law and Economics in April of 1970 by George Stigler. It's called Director's Law of Public Income Redistribution. This is related to the first segment we did about welfare. What Stigler says in this paper, and this is a concept that he names for Aaron Director, who was one of his colleagues at the University of Chicago and was Milton Friedman's brother-in-law. Director didn't write this paper, Stigler did, but it's really Director's ideas. And what he said is, in a democracy, you might think it would be the case that income redistribution would be the poor people ganging up on everybody else, or at least like the bottom half ganging up on the top half. Because in a democracy, if you have majority rule, the majority, the non-rich people, are the majority, so they should be able to gang up on the rich people, take all their stuff, and sort of do class war through democratic institutions. But Director says, no, that's actually not right. Actually, what happens is it's the middle class that gangs up on the rich and on the poor. So it's that middle 51%. And really, it's the upper middle 51%, because if you've ever spent much time around these conversations in the United States, you know that some of the most vicious class war is between the upper middle class and the upper class. It's people who are doing just a little bit better than you. And so that's what we see with programs like Social Security, like I was talking about before, like Medicare, where a lot of the benefit goes to the middle class. And it's based on the payroll tax, which takes money from the working people who tend to be poorer. Another great example of this is just general spending on higher education. The median American adult did not go to college. They certainly don't have a college degree. Yet, government views spending on higher education, which generally benefits middle class and upper middle class people, as a worthwhile use of funds, when poor people really get no benefit from it. What Director's law says is that this happens because a lot of the same things that make people poor also make it hard for them to politically organize. They have weaker communities. They have less time to think about politics, to think about political organization, because they have to work to put food on the table. The people who do have that time are middle class and upper middle class people who can form associations and lobbying groups to go to the government and say, hey, we want this benefit for us. They'll frame it as they're trying to help the poor, but if you actually look at where the money goes, a lot of times it's going to the middle class. And so this paper about Director's law helps us to understand the economic reasoning why we actually see that happening. So, again, it's called Director's Law of Public Income Redistribution by George Stigler. Read it. That's all for today. Remember, the economy is complicated and nobody has all the answers, but markets work.